preceded me in the word, in this table, and to all of you who are here today. Well, Nikos Kazantzakis' Odyssey, as you know, was first published in 1938, and since then it has mainly been considered as a 19th century old-fashioned and very long poem. Nevertheless, already in 1973, Professor Morton Levitt, who is an authority in the field of modern literature, called Kazantzakis a modernist for the use of myth he makes in his works. And more recently, Professor Roderick Beaton from the King's College claimed that his later novels could be read not just as modernist, but also as postmodernist fiction. Well, I make the assumption that some of the arguments that led scholars to these conclusions can be applied to the Odyssey. This is something I do, having considered also what these same authors had to say, in one case about Kazantzakis' Odyssey itself, and in the other about Kazantzakis' previous literary activity. Professor Levitt had linked Homer, Joyce, and Kazantzakis via modernism and the epic tradition in an article published in 1983, and Professor Beaton in 2011 related earlier works of Kazantzakis, such as Broken Souls or Serpent and Lily, which we have heard about them this morning in their relation to decadentism. Well, therefore, the aim of this paper is to discuss this statement that the Odyssey was obsolete from the beginning and to place it among the very first monuments of European modernism. This will be attempted through a close reading of the work, focusing on its position among the author's work, on its content, its philosophical background, and its formal features. The discussion will concentrate on the use of fiction and the mythical method, as well as on the use of elements coming from Cretan archaeology and mythology. From the title of this lecture, you can infer my claim that the Odyssey has a very strong Cretan character. And it's not only because of his Cretan origins that Kazantzakis focused his attention on Crete. Crete is, as I will try to show, a primary inspiration for European modernism at that time. Finally, this paper will take a comparative approach to deal with the modernistic strategies that Kazantzakis adopts both in his later fiction and those displayed in the Odyssey. Such approach can reveal more parallels between Kazantzakis' Odyssey and European modernism than previously assumed, but it can also explain the subsequent development of these same elements in the later novels. Please note that I'm talking about European and not Greek modernism, and take this broad definition of it as a framework for the discussion. This quote comes from the book by Pericles Luis, and it goes on a little bit later, saying that modernism now seems to be a movement whose roots go back well over a century and whose effects are still being felt today. So it's even broader. Although Kazantzakis' popularity among the reading public is mainly based on the novels he wrote in the last period of his life, he always thought of himself as a poet, whose magnum opus was the Odyssey. He consecrated 13 years of his life to it and 7 consecutive rewritings. It was conceived almost as a spiritual autobiography, and for that I will argue that a detailed study of the biography, the life of the author, and the historical context are required in order to understand the epic. In the Odyssey, people and events that were crucial in Kazantzakis' life are easily recognizable. He identifies himself with the second Odysseus, and so, as he reaches a turning point in his life, he goes back to his roots in antiquity, and this quest takes the form of a rewriting or a sequel to the epic. I should add here, too, the need to trace the evolution of the Odyssey as a literary theme from Homer to Kazantzakis, taking on account the influential versions of Dante and Tennyson. Thus, Kazantzakis' Odyssey can be placed within the centrifugal tradition, the one that explores the hero's desire for journey, for knowledge and experience. Such a position for the new Odyssey was claimed by Professor Stanford on his study The Ulysses Theme, published in 1954. It is no wonder for me, and I hope by the end of this presentation it will be no wonder for you as well, that Professor Stanford Compare Kazantzakis' Odyssey with the highly modernistic novel Ulysses by James Joyce that was published in 1922. Among the great number of Odyssey rewritings that appear in the 20th century, Professor Stanford considered that those of Joyce and Kazantzakis were the ones that included more elements from the classical tradition. And that is something they do within the literary environment of European modernism, which is favorable to the resemantization of myths. What I want to do next is to give an outline account of the plot. At the beginning of the new Odyssey, the hero has just arrived home after the long years of wanderings. Re-encountering his homeland, his wife, and his sons, he becomes aware, anagnorisi, that his destiny is journey, and that family and possessions are obstacles on his way. Quite a short time after his return, he leaves Ithaca forever in the company of a few trustful comrades. They arrive at Sparta, and they kidnap Helen there, thus violating the hospitality of all Menelaus. Afterward, their vessel reaches Crete, where Idomeneus' throne is challenged by the arrival of the Roman barbarians, so the Dorian invaders, from the north. Odysseus, helped by one of the Cretan princesses, sets fire to the city of Knossos and escapes with his princes. Taken by the waves toward Egypt, they sack the pharaoh's tombs and join a communistic revolution that is taking place there. They escape from prison, and they do it like Joseph in the Bible, by means of prodigies. Then they lead the people through the desert, like Moses. And at some point they sat down and found an ideal city, which is immediately destroyed by an earthquake. The hero continues his journey to the boundaries of Africa, away from geographical or temporary references, creating on his mind a whole cast of mythical personalities and episodes. Close to the end, he finds a frozen town where the people believe he's a god coming from Crete. Finally, he sails away on a tiny boat. Everything from the past to the future and the present mingles on his mind, and then he dies, fading like a flame in the air. I have read this brief summary of the poem, assuming that not everyone would be familiar with it. After all, there is a well-known saying among Kazantzakis' friends and enemies that there are only 3 persons on earth who had read every single word of the poem: the poet himself, his wife, who made handwritten copies of it, and its translator into English, Kimon Fryer. I have also read it. I'm referring to the summary. I've also read the poem, but I must recognize that not every single word in Greek. I've read it in translation. But I've read this summary because I wanted to introduce the topics I will be dealing with now: scope, philosophy, and meaning of the poem. By writing a sequel to Homer's epic, Kazantzakis rewrites the entire meaning of the Odyssey. The new hero is no longer devoted to motherland, but to his own will to self-improvement. The values and mores that once ruled society must be destroyed and give place to new ones. Such is the sense of the first 3 rhapsodies of the poem, where the hero abandons everything, betraying ancient hospitality and religion. In this transmutation of all values, the huge shadow of Friedrich Nietzsche is to be seen. The German philosopher who is regarded as one of the precursors to modernism, was also one of Kazantzakis' acknowledged masters. His influence is obvious on the author's ideas, morals, and images, and above all, on the very character of the hero, which is derived directly from Nietzsche's Superman. The scope of the journey is also entirely different. By the moment Odysseus reaches the South Pole, he has truly made a space-time travel, from ancient Greek times to the Egypt of the pharaohs, and the Christian times, from the Mediterranean to the Extreme Orient, getting to know outstanding personalities such as Hamlet, Don Quixote, Faust, Homer, Buddha, Christ. The concept of moving between different points in time and space is dear to modernism. No wonder it has to do with the influence of a French thinker whose conception of time played a determinant role in modernist literature, for example, in Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time. I am referring to Henri Bergson. Kazantzakis not only knew and translated his work, he also attended his lectures in Paris. Several features from his philosophy outstand in Kazantzakis' Odyssey, as well as in his later novels. For instance, the power of creativity, laughter, and intuition, which are the very essence both of Odysseus and Sorba, or the confusion between real time and subjective time that can be found first in the epic and then in the novels. You may remember from The Last Temptation of Christ, and if you don't, this is a spoiler, that Jesus' whole life is nothing but a dream dreamt at the cross. I want to draw your attention to the formal features of the work. Kazantzakis' Odyssey is a huge poem, 33,333 lines, written in a metrical form quite strange for Greek readers, the 17-syllable verse. Apart from this, it's also a text which is difficult to understand due to its idiosyncratic language, its over-sophisticated syntax, and many other features. Would I have more time, I would give a detailed account of the formal features of the poem, which I believe will highlight Kazantzakis' modernist method, which is to depart from tradition in order to go beyond it, to surpass it. But since I don't have that time, I will only set out the question. Modernist language is characterized by formal innovation, the concern with consciousness, and leads to the introduction of new structures that can contain and represent the different states of the human mind. Additionally, due to the weakness of narrative, structure, and unity, other modes of aesthetics ordering are to be found, and at this point, allusion to or imitation of literary models or mythical archetypes or repetition with variation of motifs, images, and symbols rise as a solution. Finally, since chronological order is no longer important, different points of view acquire relevance, taking the reader back and forth in time with cross-reference, etc. Presenting quite a few of such characteristics, the Odyssey appears as a good example of modernistic formal innovation and experimentation. As a consequence, it is no doubt a complex work, but there are clues and even magical keys to open it, and Kazantzakis give us one. A considerable part of the poem, of the Odyssey, takes place in Crete, Rhapsodies 5 to 8. It is no wonder, not surprising, taking on account that Homer's Odyssey, there is also a great part of Homer's Odyssey which takes place at Crete. Which one is this? Well, it's one of those false tales that Ulysses tells when he does not want to reveal his identity. There may be small differences between them, but the essence remains the same. Whenever the hero lies to Eumaeus, to Athena, he says he's a Cretan. There are several arguments and studies, such as those of Vivanti, Haft, or Grossart, leading to the conclusion that by mentioning Crete in ancient literature, the audience was aware that a fiction was taking place. I can't get into the details now, but it's my belief that Kazantzakis was aware of this literary game and that he deliberately based a big part of his epic on the false tales told by Homeric Ulysses. As Yorgos Stamatiu pointed out on his book O Kazantzakis και Αρχαίοι, the hero's travel from Crete to Egypt and his adventures there seems to be taken straight out from Homer's false tales. Such use of the motif of lies and fictitious Cretan narrations implies both intimate acquaintances with classical tradition and with modernistic, sophisticated techniques. And now I want to turn to one of the most known among them. Eliot praised the mythical method in Joyce's Ulysses in these terms, quote, "In manipulating a continuous parallel between contemporaneity and antiquity, Mr. Joyce is pursuing a method which others must pursue after him. One of those was Kazantzakis. I won't argue whether or not he did it consciously, that is, if he was influenced by Joyce or not, because I haven't studied the question. Instead, I will focus on what I do know that they share, which is this manipulation of a continuous parallel between contemporaneity and antiquity. And I will use as an example the case of Princess Dictena. On the island of Crete, when the hero arrives there, rules the king Idomeneus. And this king, as in tales, has 3 daughters, Phida, Crino, and Dictena. Phida and Crino, so the serpent and the lily, again, as in the novel. And Dictena, that comes from Mount Dicte, Dicteonandron. This Dictena is the priestess of the holy harlots, and as such, she leads the hero to the mystery of the island, to the center of a fertility ritual. She then helps him kill the beast inside, which is her own father. After that, she leaves her native land with him, and soon she is abandoned while she sleeps. The mythical reference is, I believe, quite clear, since this Dictena is no other than a new Ariadne. What is contemporary in her is the contrast to her mythical predecessor. This Dictena, this princess, assumes an active role in seducing the foreigner and does not regret the situation. Left in an Egyptian harbor, she will wake up, and watching the many strong sailors around her, she will smile. According to Eliot, the mythical method is a way of controlling, of ordering, of giving shape and significance to the immense panorama of futility and anarchy which is contemporary history. It is no surprise that in such panorama the artists of the 20th century will turn to Crete. Crete was the cradle of Europe, and the Cretan mythological cycle expressed only too well the tensions that preceded the Second World War. Therefore was the obsession for the Minoans so typical of the period. Several studies deal with this question. Cretan myths seem modern because they were brutal and they dealt with sexual desire, perversion, violence, tyranny, disobedience, obscurantism, and evil. The Minoan mythology and religion, as understood by Kazantzakis' contemporaries, helped him to create a highly modernistic imaginary in which the majority of the characters from the myth appear in complex combinations. A detailed study of Kazantzakis' Odyssey not only shows the dependence of the epic on ancient Cretan myths, on the Cretan motif of lies, or on the ancient and modern Cretan folklore, but also on the recent, at that time, excavations of Sir Arthur Evans in Knossos. Since Heinrich Schliemann managed to dig up Troy with Homer's Iliad as a guide and Howard Carter had made great discoveries at Egypt, archaeology had become an upward trend among artists. Kazantzakis was an impressionable kid by the time these excavations were taking place, and the archaeological sites are skillfully evoked in many of his works. In turn, Mycenae, Crete, and Egypt are all settings for the Odyssey. The poem is pervaded by Evans' controversial ideas about the so-called Minoan civilization. The Gnossian frescoes explain scenes from the Odyssey, like the bull leaping that causes Princess Crino's death. And they also explain its characters, which are described as part of a Minoan setting. We have just seen these 3 princesses and the ladies in blue from the frescoes, the bull leaping, but also Princess Crino, which is Princess Lily, is no other than the Prince of the Lilies. The last subject I will discuss are some of the modernistic strategies that Kazantzakis adopts both in his later fiction and in his Odyssey. I have already mentioned some similarities as well as some recurrent patterns, and I will quickly summarize 2 more features now. According to Professor Beaton, thanks.
Two more minutes.
I have it. According to Professor Beaton, Kazantzakis uses modernistic techniques in his later novels, like systematical historical references or the mythical method. The first technique requires no explanation, since systematic historical references, either to the ancient, Byzantine, or modern times, are used everywhere on Kazantzakis' works. As for the second, the heroes in his novels take indeed mythical roles. the most immediate example being Manolios in the Greek Passion, who assumes in such depth his role as Christ in the play that comes to act like him in the real life. But the heroes in the Odyssey, they do exactly the same. Odysseus becomes Paris when he kidnaps Helen, Theseus when he arrives to Crete, Moses in the desert, Dictena plays the part of Ariadne, Helen that of Europe and Pasiphae, Idomeneus is both Minos and the Minotaur, etc. The author is running something more than a symbolical mechanism here. His characters, like those in Joyce's Ulysses, impersonate eternal mythical roles. This technique is tested in the Odyssey, where Kazantzakis uses scenes from antiquity to talk about universal as well as contemporary conflicts. And he also operates in every level and in every work with archetypes. Regardless of whether they know it or not, his characters act according to the mythical archetypes they represent. This is a brilliant discovery by the Cretan author, who practiced it a great deal in his Odyssey before he developed it further in the novels. Well, the main point of this paper was to show the double character of Kazantzakis' Odyssey, its Cretan and modernistic aspects. Therefore, I have tried to explain the Cretan components of the epic via its relation to European modernism, through elements such as the use of fiction, the mythical method, the concern for language, the subconscious, and experimentation. I agree that to some extent the Odyssey does belong to the 19th century literary fashions, but it is not quite as straightforward as that. And a closer look, as the one I have tried to bring here, can reveal unexpected parallels with 20th century sensibilities, aesthetics, and concerns. Those parallels convey to the hypothesis I mentioned in the beginning, that that modernism, which will evolve in Kazantzakis' later novels, as Professor Beaton has shown, already exists in the Odyssey in germ or as a draft. In conclusion, an interpretation of Kazantzakis' Odyssey as a Cretan and a modernist masterpiece may not only give further evidence to this new perspective recently applied to his fiction, but also change the understanding of his major and fundamental work. Thank you very much.